The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people, and they know what happened here. I'm a very innocent man.
Today might be one of those days when you ask yourself in years to come, where were you when a former president of the United States was found guilty on 34 felony counts? I'm Gadi Schwartz, and this is Stay Tuned Now. And what started off as a quiet day two of jury deliberations took a 180 real quick, with a group of 12 New Yorkers finding former President Donald Trump guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records. In other words, the presumptive Republican presidential nominee is now the first former U.S. president to be found guilty of a crime. And we don't know yet if that verdict is going to result in probation or Trump sitting in prison, but we will find out on July 11th. That's just 4 days before he's scheduled to step on the stage for the Republican National Convention. And just shortly after the verdict was announced, the Trump campaign wasted no time sending out a fundraising email in which Trump said in all caps, "I am a political prisoner." Let's bring in NBC's Hallie Jackson. Hallie, first and most obvious question here for so many Americans tonight. How likely is it that Trump is physically going to be put in shackles and booked into a prison here?
Not likely. Just totally candidly here. We know when the sentencing is going to be, Gadi, and it's good to be with you tonight on this really historic evening here with these guilty convictions now for former President Trump. Here's the deal. He's going to be sentenced on July 11th. From what legal experts have told us, it is unlikely that the former president will end up behind bars. Obviously, that is a possibility. There is a chance that it happens. But remember, he is a first-time offender. This is a nonviolent set of crimes that he's been convicted of, these falsification of business records here. And so the guidance from the folks who are immersed and steeped in the law of it all is that it is unlikely that Judge Merchan would sentence him. There is, listen, if it happens, there is this dynamic of the Secret Service. Remember, this is somebody who is entitled to and who gets Secret Service protection by dint of being formally in the White House here, Gadi. And so that is a dynamic that's at play here. One legal expert has suggested there are other options. If there were to be some kind of confinement, there are other options that the judge could do, like, for example, home confinement, et cetera. Again, that does seem outside the realm of likelihood here, but just want to give you a sense of what's on the table.
Always love that, Hallie Jackson, realism. Hallie, Donald Trump notably saying that the real verdict is going to be on November 5th by the people. Can you give us an overview of what kind of bearing you see this having on the election? Yeah,
it's a great question, Gadi, and I think it is one that at this point, at least, as we sit here on May 30th, is unanswerable, at least for now. Now, there are some signals that we've gotten from polling previously that suggest that, 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans, when polled over the course of the last month, say that whatever happens here, whatever the guilty or not guilty situation was, it isn't going to change their vote. They're going to vote the same way regardless. That said, when you look at the numbers, about a 10% to 23% of independent voters have suggested that a conviction would make them less likely to vote for former President Trump. We know that about 60% of independents believe that the charges brought in this hush money case are serious. Why does that matter? 10%, that's not a big number. 20%, not a huge number here. But this is a very close election, and it is independent voters who are going to be critical in determining who ends up in the White House come November. All that said, it is different to poll a hypothetical than it is to poll a reality. Right now that this reality is in front of voters, what will they say moving forward at this point? The reaction from both candidates will matter. And there's something interesting that has happened here, too, Gadi. A rare moment of agreement between Donald Trump and Joe Biden here, because both of them say that the political verdict is going to come from the American people in November.
And Hallie, this is one of those days where you log on to the internet and it seems like everyone's an expert, and yet there are some people who have been watching this, following all the ins and outs of this case, and are still tonight like, wait, I know it's 34 felony counts, and I know that it has to do with that one payment to Stormy Daniels, but what's he guilty of in layman's terms here? You're so much better than this, than I am at breaking this down. But is it basically lying on business records to cover up this payoff and affect the 2016 election?
You are great at this, Gadi, and I would just slightly tweak what you've said here, which is this. The actual charges, the actual counts that he was convicted on are 34 counts of falsification of business records. 34 counts because it involved series of checks, entries into the general ledger and invoices from Michael Cohen, right? So it's these documents. It's literally, pieces of paper. It's records. That is the actual counts that he's been convicted on here. Now, they are felony counts. Typically, they'd be misdemeanors. They are felony counts because the jury has now decided that there was essentially an object crime, that he was doing this falsification in subject of a second criminal offense by unlawful means, essentially, and that is election interference. That is the case that the prosecution laid out, that it was essentially to try to interfere in the 2016 election. So that is what he is found guilty of. I will say this, it is not illegal to have an NDA, right? Like a non-disclosure agreement. That is not against the law. The piece of this that is this jury has decided is against the law that he's been convicted on is essentially making those payments as almost like a campaign contribution to help him on the campaign without actually reporting it. So that's what this really all comes down to here.
All right, and Hallie, feel free to reel me in here, but his defense seemed to be very much like, I didn't know what was going on. I'm a busy man. I had no idea. And it seems like this conviction is like, yeah, you did. You knew what was going on, and it was fraudulent, and you lied, and you were responsible for what happened.
Well,
is that oversimplifying?
The issue of intent was central to this, right? Did he have the intent to try to conceal a crime here? And so the jury has found, by finding him guilty on all 34 counts. And there was a question, maybe it would be a mixed verdict, that they would acquit him on some counts, find him guilty on the others. That's not the case. It's 34 for 34 here as it relates to a guilty verdict from the jury. And so essentially, the issue of intent is one that the jury found exists here for former President Trump. Now, his defense took a couple of different tacks, right? It was, hey, these weren't falsified. This wasn't illegal in the first place. But the other thing they tried to do was to seriously discredit the prosecution's star witness here, Michael Cohen, whose testimony was front and center in this case. He is somebody who has acknowledged lying to a lot of various entities, to a lot of various people here. And the defense went after him again and again, hammered him to basically cast doubt on his credibility, to say to the jury, wait a second, you're going to believe Michael Cohen? You're going to believe this guy here? Clearly, the jury, by virtue of the verdict that they came back with, did find Michael Cohen to be, to a degree, credible here. I will note that the prosecution made a point, and you heard it in the closing arguments from prosecutors here, they made a point to say, almost everything that Michael Cohen said to you is backed up by documents, by receipts, by other evidence as well.
A lot of receipts in this one. And the sentencing, we're looking at 4 days before the Republican convention. Yeah. That is such a clash of court and campaign calendars. Does this further galvanize the GOP behind Trump, or is there a possibility that we could see any breakup or any schisms form?
We have seen none so far, right? I mean, we have seen, in fact, the opposite, Gadi, which is the Republican Party moving very quickly to back up former President Trump as it relates to his claims that this was in his words, or in his view, I should say, I'm paraphrasing, a sham trial, that this was rigged, et cetera, starting with the most powerful Republican in Congress, which is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, who came out almost immediately calling this a shameful day in American history. And there is a laundry list of Republican lawmakers who have come out and echoed that sentiment, including many who were on the sort of short list to potentially be the former president's running mate here. I will say this, as you talk about the calendar. So just to tell you, real talk, Gadi, judge says July 11th. We see this in our notes coming in from our team in the courtroom that sentencing is July 11th. Immediately, I pulled out my Google Calendar and I said, that is 4 days before the Republican convention is supposed to start, because mid-July is a critical moment. That is when the current presumptive Republican nominee, who has now been convicted of these felonies, will be we don't have to say the word presumptive anymore. He is expected to be the nominee. And the other collision course here, too, is this Veep stakes race, because the former president has suggested he will not pick a running mate until closer to the convention, until maybe in early July. You look back to 2016, he selected Mike Pence as his running mate, or at least formally announced it, just 3 days before the start of that year's convention. So might you have this moment where the former president is naming a running mate, getting sentenced for felonies, and then going and showing up to be nominated for the Republican presidential nomination? That is entirely in the realm of possibility.
Yeah, I think you just replaced the word election in my brain with collision course. Hallie Jackson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Guy.
And let's bring in our panel of legal analysts, NBC News legal analyst Angela Sinandella, criminal defense attorney Misty Maris, and here in the studio with me is white-collar criminal defense attorney Sarah Azari. Sarah, let's start with you here. That was an extremely quick verdict by so many accounts. I mean, especially when you look at the jury instructions there. What's your take on the speed in which we saw this verdict come back?
Right. There's all kinds of myths, Gadi, around, jury deliberations on how long they go. But one that, in my experience, has always been true is if it's a quick verdict, it's a guilty verdict. So I predicted that we're going to go until at least Friday. I was surprised. I have to say, pleasantly surprised, like many. But, this was a complex indictment of 34 counts with very complex instructions that were not before the jury. But we'd be remiss to think that there was no benefit in having two lawyers on this jury. And even though these jurors, I'm not, at all suggesting that they influenced the other jurors or somehow interfered with their deliberations, it is helpful to have two attorneys on a jury in this kind of case. So that could have been why this moved along, swiftly. But certainly, it to me is, look, at some point we have to accept that this is justice. The DA's office put on a very compelling case, and the closing arguments were stellar in the way that they connected all the dots. And so the jury's spoken. I mean, I think we need to accept that just because it was a swift verdict does not make it any less of a verdict, or illegal verdict in any way.
Angela, Trump brought up venue in his remarks. Actually, if we can cue that up, let's take a quick listen to what he said.
It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial.
Okay, so when he's talking about the election, when he's talking about the political demographic makeup there, do you think that played a role here, or did Todd Blanche blow it?
Look, Gadi, it's impossible to tell, but I will say that the bar to actually get a venue change is so high, and the political persuasion of the demographic of where you are located is really irrelevant in terms of a change of venue motion like this. So we will never know what really went into this decision until we hear jurors speak, and in this case, it seems unlikely many will come forward just given the whole context of this case. But I think it's impossible to say, Gadi.
Now, Misty, what is sentencing going to look like in this case? This is something that I kept thinking over and over again every time I saw Trump come out and violate the gag order, because obviously the jury returns a verdict, but the judge is in charge of sentencing. And this is the judge that Trump attacked over and over and over again on the steps of the courthouse, violating all those gag orders. So do you think that could influence whether he goes to prison or not?
The judge definitely has a lot of discretion when it comes to sentencing, but to that point, it really shouldn't influence his whatever he's going to do as far as a sentence. What happens at a sentencing is that in the interim, Trump is going to meet with the probation department in New York. They're going to generate a report. There's going to be certain issues, risk factors, for instance, the nature of the crime, whether or not it's a first-time offender. They'll make a recommendation. The defense will say, we think he should have a lighter sentence because of this. And then the prosecution will also make a recommendation. That is what's going to go into the judge's determination. The fact that there were personal attacks, while that's, not maybe the best thing to do with the person that holds your fate in their hands, it really shouldn't move the needle as far as which way the judge goes.
And Sarah, Alvin Bragg, he also spoke after all this went down today about the jurors in particular. I want to take a listen to what he had to say.
The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. I did my job. We did our job. Many voices out there. The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken.
The jury has spoken, and yet this is a case that we should remember. The feds didn't prosecute. His predecessor didn't prosecute. So what do you think he saw in this case that made him want to prosecute?
I think he took a big chance, power to him. He took a big chance at this case, and this could have, I mean, initially I thought it's so complex, it's not going to get anywhere. But again, I think that the job that the DA's office did, and also the benefit that came with having two attorneys on this jury was tremendous. And one thing to Misty's point, I, too, agree that this would be a probation case if it was you and I being sentenced. But this is not about him just bad-mouthing the judge. This is about him violating and being held in contempt 10 times. So if it was us, we'd be in jail already on time number 2, and yet 10 times. And he says, so I believe that there's still part of me believes that Judge Merchant may have reserved that, remand to see whether he's going to be guilty or not at the end of this case.
And Angela, I do want to ask about the jurors on this case. I mean, we saw Trump over and over again attacking the judge in the case, and there are specific instructions to leave the jurors alone, if you will. But if we start to see Trump attack the jurors on Truth Social or in some of his statements, what could happen then?
So I think, as Sarah just said, I think that would be very relevant in possibly giving him an actual jail sentence. If you look at the numbers of this level of Class E felony, the vast majority, and over 70% in New York State, do not get any jail time. So I think from a default, from a bar, this judge is really trying not to treat him any differently from any other defendant. So I think he's really going to try to not to put him in jail. But if he were to continue to violate this gag order, and what's still interesting is that this gag order is still in effect even after the trial is over, then I think that it is clear that that could possibly then raise this to an issue where we would end up in jail, because there are so many factors that could go into the judge's discretion here. And as Sarah said, one of the big ones is whether or not this seriousness of this offense really was in violating an election and changing an election. But my guess is that this judge is going to try to be as least controversial as possible, really try to treat the defendant like others and not throw him in jail.
And Misty, there is so much backseat, defense lawyering going on today. But do you think that the defense made a mistake in kind of putting all their eggs in the Michael Cohen liar basket?
The reason that they did that was for the purpose of what we saw in the jury instructions. Whenever you have a witness, the jury assesses the credibility. And the defense really spent a lot of time trying to undermine Michael Cohen's credibility in the hopes that the jurors would actually dismiss his testimony in total. Clearly, the jurors did not do that. They have the option of accepting all of the testimony, some of the testimony, or actually scrapping it all. And I think that's why the defense actually focused on that. But I think they made some serious mistakes. For instance, talking about Stormy Daniels and whether or not an affair hand, the witness that they put on the stand. There were some very, very specific legal issues that really lost focus because of all of these sideshows. And I think the defense focus on that really, really distracted and ultimately did not serve them when it came time for the closing arguments and ultimately for jury deliberation.
Yeah, so many balls being juggled there. Misty, thank you so much. Sarah, thank you for joining us. And Angela, thank you. I hope you guys stick around because we are going to be doing some more analysis in just a bit. But for now, let's bring in NBC's Ali Rafa, who's in Delaware, where President Biden arrived earlier today. Ali, what's the White House saying about the verdict?
Yeah, Gadi, a very simple and short answer to that when we heard from the White House counsel's office earlier in a statement just saying that they, quote, respect the rule of law and they have no additional comment. And you compare that with the reaction that we've seen from the Biden campaign that is seizing on this moment and using it really as an opportunity to raise awareness of what they say are the stakes of this election, to remind voters of what they say would be a completely chaotic White House if Trump were to win a second term in office. They said in a statement just minutes after this verdict was read that, quote, no one is above the law. They said that the only way to keep former President Trump out of the Oval Office is at the ballot box. And they also recognized that former President Trump would be the GOP nominee, of course, with this sentencing of his coming just 4 days before the GOP convention. The campaign also firing off a series of fundraising emails and
texts asking for supporters and saying, really, if there was any moment for supporters to donate to the Biden campaign, it's now. Well aware of the fact that the Trump campaign is already fundraising off of this verdict. And as far as the president himself, Gadi, we have not heard reaction from President Biden himself. A senior White House aide is saying that at this point we don't expect that to happen tonight. Remember, the president earlier today was in Wilmington, Delaware, where he marked the 9th anniversary of his late son Beau's death. And shortly after that, the White House called a lid, meaning we wouldn't see or hear from the president for the rest of the day after he got here to his Rehoboth Beach home. And so the earliest opportunity for the president to speak about this in person, for reporters to ask the president about this, would be tomorrow, when we expect the president to leave Rehoboth Beach and head back to the White House for an event honoring the Kansas City Chiefs. And so that is likely going to be where reporters will likely pepper the president with questions about this, Gadi.
This is such a weird time in the campaign, but obviously so much of that is the Biden campaign. Then there's the Biden White House. So how has the White House treated the trial up to this point? And could we see their approach to all this changing going forward?
Well, the White House up until this point has been largely quiet about these ongoing legal woes of the former president, because remember, the former president has used these court appearances of his to attack President Biden, saying that this is a Biden trial, that these trials are keeping former President Trump off of the campaign trail and away from his 2024 rival. And so to keep this image, this belief of President Biden that the Justice Department should be independent, this vow of his that he's had since the 2020 election, they are largely being quiet about this. That is expected to change, though, on the campaign side, because we do expect the president at some point to address this verdict. It's still unclear whether that's going to be in a formal speech, in a statement, whether he simply answers a reporter's question about it. But we are told from sources familiar with these plans that when he does, the president will ask Americans to honor this verdict from these jurors, to honor the independence of the Justice Department, and to recognize this verdict for what it is. But all in all, the Biden campaign, the White House as a whole, is trying to use this and all of the other ongoing legal cases of the former presidents to really paint this picture, this contrast between President Biden and former President Trump, this character contrast, trying to paint the former president as chaotic and talk about what he has vowed to do and has said he would do if granted another term in the White House. Gadi.
Ali Rafa in Delaware for us tonight. Thank you so much, Ali. And turning now to NBC's Dasha Burns, who has been at the courthouse all week. And in fact, Dasha, I was watching earlier, as that was read, as the verdict came back, I saw you and your crew just basically sprint straight into the crowd to start getting reaction. So I want to ask, what was the vibe and what is the vibe there in New York right now?
Yeah, Gadi, it was a serious moment here. You could really feel the entire area just kind of wrapped up in the history-making moment that this really was. So we ran into the crowd. There's a park just across the street from the courthouse, where throughout this entire process, the public has been coming to demonstrate, to exercise our First Amendment rights. And today, the crowd was really a huge cross-section of the tri-state area, a very diverse crowd, people in favor of the former president, people who were not his biggest fans. So when that moment came, when we all learned not only that there was a verdict, but what the verdict actually was, a huge eruption of sounds, of boos and of cheers. And when we went into that crowd, we really got a mix of response. I want you to take a listen to some of what we heard.
We're watching the legal system work the way it's supposed to work in a democracy.
If the evidence pointed to him and they was found that he was guilty, sure, he's guilty.
I'm not surprised at all. I really did think there was going to be a guilty verdict, but I see this as he's going to win an appeal, and they're not going to stop him from being able to win the presidency again.
Gadi, there were MAGA hats and flags. There were also guys dressed up in an orange prison jumpsuit with a Trump mask on. I mean, it was all kinds of folks that came out here to make their voices heard, and we were right there in the middle with them.
Yeah, really appreciate you getting their perspective. And to the former president's point here, arguably the most consequential verdict is going to come down November 5th. I do want to take a look at something, though, if we have it. Here's a poll where the majority of voters said that the verdict would have no bearing on their vote. More likely to vote for Trump if he's guilty, 15%, and then not guilty, 8%. This is among independent voters. How does this verdict change the 2024 campaign?
It's a really important question, Gadi, and this is interesting as I've been talking to voters of all stripes, right? You've got some that feel like this has solidified their support for the former president even more. You saw just today his website crash, those small dollar donors coming to support him. We've seen this every time that he has had either an indictment drop or some development in his legal troubles where people do rally around him. In large part, that's one of the reasons he won the primary with such an overwhelming victory. On the other hand, you've got these other voters that are not happy with either of their choices, that are concerned about the election in November. And we've talked to people who say, look, I'm not paying a ton of attention to the trial. I don't think that it should be happening. But if he were found guilty, I might have to think twice about casting a ballot for the former president. So the question really is, are there more of those people that are going to get engaged in the process, rally to support Trump and turn out when maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, right? Or are there going to be more of those people, those independent voters, and in states where, you know, these margins might be really tight, that say, you know what, I just can't put my vote next to someone who has been voted by a jury here in New York who has been found guilty of these crimes, Gadi.
When it comes to those independent voters, I mean, how does the Biden campaign, capitalize on what's happened when the Biden White House is going to be kind of firewalling themselves or keeping themselves at a distance from the state courts and what may have happened in New York? It seems like it's a very mixed signal to send to people that may be still trying to decide.
Yeah, Gadi, it's been a real strategy of the Biden team to stay away from all of this legal stuff for the vast majority of this trial and for the other indictments that he's facing as well. But we saw a change in that this week. You saw some surrogates for the Biden campaign. Robert De Niro, for example, actually come out here outside of the courtroom and try to set up a contrast. And we know, based on our reporting from our colleagues at the White House, that the Biden team is prepared to kind of turn up the heat now that this trial is over, that Biden will likely be referring to Trump as not the former president, but as a felon, as a convict, to start to really get voters to see him in that way rather than what he's been trying to get voters to see him as, which is a victim and as a political prisoner. And in fact, he's been sending out fundraising emails with that exact slogan today. So watch for the Biden team to ramp up their campaigning and to start to twist the knife a little bit and get a little sharper in their criticisms of Trump, especially when it comes to all of this legal stuff, Gadi.
Meanwhile, I've never seen so many posts from the former president's sons or TikToks for that matter. I know Eric Trump a little bit earlier posted tonight, May 30th, 2024 might be remembered as the day Donald J. Trump won the 2024 presidential election. Dasha, do you think there may be some truth to this? Does this help or hurt his chances with independent voters?
Look, it could be right? I mean, I have talked to a lot of voters who find that there is just, they say to me, there's just too much. There's too much of this. There are too many cases. It does feel like political persecution, and that message is resonating. And that's, of course, common with the hardcore Trump supporters, but I've heard it from some more independent voters as well. But like I said, there is that shaky ground, especially for the people that, for example, cast their ballots for Nikki Haley. In Pennsylvania, she won, 15 to 20% in certain key counties. Those voters are the ones I'm going to be watching for, because what are they going to think about this? What direction is this going to push them? At the same time, again, you're seeing his website crash. You're seeing a lot of people come to his aid, and this does take up a lot of the news cycle. He is out there. Even the Biden campaign has said that they have felt handcuffed by this trial. Well, his legal troubles are not over. He is not done talking about this and campaigning on this and fundraising on this. So it could potentially also be a benefit. As crazy as that is to say, Gadi, I mean, to be found guilty, to, you know, have felon, convict, whatever next to your name when you're running for president in any other universe would be a bad thing. But I don't think that that is how former President Trump and his campaign team are going to spin it. And they might just be successful with enough voters to turn this into a positive for him. Gadi?
A lot to think about there. Dasha, thank you. And joining us now is Hogan Gidley, former National Press Secretary for the 2020 Trump campaign and former Deputy Press Secretary for the Trump administration. Hogan, thank you so much. Got to ask, what do you think is going through the former president's mind tonight?
Well, I think he was pretty open and transparent with the American people when he spoke right after the verdict. I mean, rarely, if ever, does Donald Trump say something publicly that he doesn't say privately to me or to others around him. And the fact is, he pointed to this in several ways. He said things like, the real verdict is on November 5th. It's coming. He said this is far from over, obviously hinting at the fight we have ahead of us for the November election, but also for the fact that the appeal will most likely overturn this ridiculous outcome that most people, most legal experts say just doesn't pass any muster, which is odd for a lot of reasons because most judges don't want their rulings overturned, but it seems like we're headed for that in short order. One thing, though, I thought was interesting was he did point to the venue, Manhattan. We know a lot of people in Manhattan just don't like Donald Trump, and I've done some work with Alan Dershowitz, for example, a famed attorney, on the first impeachment trial with Donald Trump when I was in the White House, and he pointed to venue being a problem in all of these cases because they're in areas that typically have a lot of residents who don't like Donald Trump and aren't Republicans. And so I think that's just a culmination today of kind of the predictions we all thought would happen, which was a conviction for the former president.
Oh, I do want to ask, but what kind of effect do you think today's verdict is going to have on independent voters, especially if this is a three-way race and we see this conviction being used to attack Trump by both Biden as well as RFK Jr.?
Yeah, sure. Look, I don't think we know in totality, but let me give you some kind of benchmarks. This just happened, so it's kind of brand new. But leading up to this point, 67% of Americans believe that these attacks on Donald Trump through lawfare are politically motivated. 59% of Americans believe that Joe Biden is part of it. In addition, 69% of independents believe these attacks are politically motivated. That tells me a lot of folks out there are looking at the weaponization of the federal government, not just against Donald Trump, but against them in their everyday lives as well. They're rejecting it, whether it be the judicial system, the FBI, whatever. So right off the bat, the American people are predisposed to believing that the government's going after Donald Trump. Now, I can speak anecdotally. I've received a lot of text messages from people who are not Trump supporters who say, wait a minute, this is a step too far. I don't like Trump, but you shouldn't try to kick your opponent off the ballot. You shouldn't try to jail your opponent like the Biden administration is trying to do. So I'm rejecting it. I'm going to vote for Trump. You talked about earlier in this segment how donors are crashing Donald Trump's website because they want to give massive amounts of money coming in. $1 million donor I know of just called and said, I'm giving over $1 million to the campaign. This is the way the reaction will be initially. This quote-unquote bombshell, a word the media likes to use, is something that'll settle over the next several days. We'll find out more about the jurors. We'll find out more about the process. Originally, this was kind of a Nancy Pelosi. You're in California. It's a Nancy Pelosi prosecution. We'll have to convict him to find out what's in it because they didn't find out what the real crime was until the closing arguments, of course. So a lot of people are going to look back at this, and you see these poll numbers begin to shift once you find out more information. Remember, in 2020, they thought Biden would be the one to fix the border or fix the economy or bring down the temperature and unite Americans. Now it's the exact opposite because they have more information, so voters trust Trump on all those issues. The same thing, I think, applies to this case. Right now, a flash poll may show one thing, but as we move closer and closer to November, closer and closer to the sentencing in July or whenever it is, we're going to start to really see where voters stand on this topic, and I guarantee you, both Biden is going to try to use this against Trump because what they wanted was to bleed him dry financially. They wanted to go after him to prevent him from going on the campaign trail. And, of course, the cherry on top, to be able to call him a convicted felon. The right will use this and say, wait a minute. They're going after average Americans. They're going after the president. They're utilizing levers of power and influence in the federal government to do so. This is a threat to democracy. So it is going to be the battle lines here that really kind of separate where these voters fall in the next several weeks and months.
I think you're totally right about the battle lines. However, the stats you were throwing out at the beginning, I am not familiar with them. I'm not saying you're right. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I don't have those numbers, can't verify the poll numbers that you were citing there. But you brought up kind of this idea of the weaponization or the possible weaponization of the justice system, which is something that we hear from Donald Trump time and time again, calling this a political witch hunt, talking about how the justice system has been weaponized. And there's also this term that's floating around a lot these days, especially on the right, which is this lawfare term. I want to ask you, if Donald Trump is elected and he feels so strongly about what he's saying about the justice system, what do you think he'll do to try to change what he calls injustice?
Well, from the federal government's level, I don't know what he can do. I can tell you only what he's actually said, which is he doesn't have time for retribution. He has to go out there and fix all of the failed policies of the Biden administration that have been kicking the teeth in for the American people for the last 4 years. That's what he says he's going to focus on. At the same time, what I would not be surprised of, though, is if Republican DAs, Republican AGs started going after Democrat office holders up to and including Joe Biden and maybe even his son at this point. Look, we've got a long way to go till November. Another trial is about to start, too, and that's 10% for the big guy, Hunter Biden himself. And there's going to be a lot that comes out about Joe Biden in that instance, too. So this is far from over. This is just kind of the beginning of the whole thing. And I was joking with some people in the green room earlier. We're all exhausted. It's May. We hadn't even got through the summer yet, for heaven's sake. So we better just buckle up because this is going to be a long way to go between now and November.
Hogan, thank you for that very stark reminder.
Yes.
Hogan, thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it, guys.
And you are watching continuing coverage of today's historic verdict. Former President Donald Trump found guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records. NBC News law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter was at the court while the verdict was read. And here's what he told NBC's Savannah Guthrie about what it was like inside the courtroom in that critical moment.
Tom, there is nothing like the tension in a courtroom right before a verdict is read. Tell us what it was like in there, whether the jurors looked at the former president, and any other color you can provide from the courtroom.
Sure. Well, it was really a 180 in what occurred in there because the judge brought us in. First off, the prosecution just showed up. We did not hear the bell. It's a 1960s rotary style bell that we typically hear when the jury has something to tell the court. That's what we've been hearing over the past day or so. The prosecution comes in. All of a sudden, Donald Trump and his team come in, and the judge says, look, it's my intention here to let the jury go at 4:30. And 4:30 comes and goes, and we're about 5 or 6 minutes past that. He comes in. He says, well, we received a note from the jury at 4:20 saying they have reached a verdict, and they want about 30 minutes or so more to be able to go through the paperwork and go count by count and item by item. At that point, the mood in the court completely changed. You could even hear the air conditioning system in there over just a couple of keyboard strokes from reporters that were in the courtroom. Obviously, the tension built. Prior to that, the former president and his defense attorney were talking as if the day was over. They were laughing with each other, covering their mouths so that the cameras that are viewed in the overflow courtroom weren't seen. And so the focus was just kind of the day is done. And immediately the gravity of the moment struck everybody in the courtroom, prosecution and defense. And you saw a real change at the defense table, understanding that this was really it. To your point, Savannah, I noticed the jurors, and I did not see all of them coming in because of just the way that the courtroom was set up, but I did not see any of them make any eye contact with Donald Trump prior to the verdict being read. I did not see them make any eye contact with the prosecution either. At that point, the judge asked the jury foreperson, have you reached a verdict without telling me? He said yes. He stood. They handed him a handheld mic, which allowed all of us to hear what he was going to say. And then one of the courtroom staff members went count by count. All those 34 counts, which as you well know by now, were all guilty. There was not a ton of reaction within the courtroom. We had been strongly admonished by the court security officers. They didn't want any sort of outbursts of any type. Once the jury was polled, which, as you know, is the moment where the judge or the court asks each individual juror if what the foreperson read was accurate. They said yes, and then at that point they were let out, and there did not appear to be any sort of significant eye contact there either. And there were some jurors that, of course, over the course of a trial, as you know, are more animated than others. Some take more notes than others. But even those that were a little bit more animated, I didn't detect any sort of kind of a telling of what the verdict would be prior to it being read. So obviously a kind of a quick turn of events, putting all of this in perspective. For years, going back to September 2019, when the Manhattan District Attorney's Office asked for Donald Trump's tax records, asked for his financial documents, the two Supreme Court battles that followed all throughout the pandemic up until the point when they got those documents, at that point there, Savannah, this case kind of moved forward slowly because there was a bit of a change here at the office. There was an election. There was a different district attorney, as you know, that came in and took office. And the plan of attack, if you will, for this investigation and case changed after that point. And eventually we got the charges that we got today, and approximately a year later, well, here we are now talking about a verdict. Where does this go from here has been so often the question involving investigations surrounding Donald Trump for the past 6-7 years or so. Today, this is kind of a big moment because we have no indication whatsoever that there is now going to be any sort of ongoing criminal jeopardy for the former president and presumptive Republican nominee going forward. None from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, no indication that they're doing any additional work, no indication that the federal prosecutors about 2 blocks from me and the FBI 2 blocks from me is doing anything involving any sort of investigation involving the former president as it pertains or has a nexus to New York. Obviously, there's the other cases that you well know about. So it's a big moment today, a bit of a period on a number of investigations going back to the Michael Cohen guilty plea in federal court that surrounded all the conduct in this case. And so now we'll just have to see where those other 2 cases go. But as far as things go from here in his hometown, where so much of these investigations originated from or involved, including the conviction and jailing of his chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, and the conviction of his company, it's over.
Tom Winter, thank you so much. Now, shortly after the verdict, former President Donald Trump spoke to reporters about the trial and the jury's decision right there on the courthouse steps. So we want to take a listen to what he had to say.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Former president there responding to being convicted of 34 felony counts. We're also hearing from Michael Cohen for the first time since the verdict. He just spoke on MSNBC moments ago, and here was his reaction to the jury's decision. Let's take a look.
I guess the word is relieved. This has been 6 years in the making. Remember, the very first time that I met with the district attorney's office, we talked about it when I was on your show after putting out Disloyal. The very first time I ever met with the district attorney's office was while I was an inmate in Otisville. They came up to see me on 3 separate occasions. So this is a 6-year process within which for accountability to finally be had.
The problematic witness, if you will, at the center of so much of this. So let's bring in our legal panel again. NBC News legal analyst Angela Sinandela, criminal defense attorney Misty Maris, and white-collar criminal defense attorney Sarah Azari. Thank you so much for being with us again. Let's see. Starting with you, Angela, let's talk about Michael Cohen here. And when it comes to this this ability to see this trial, hindsight being 2020, do you think he was as big of a deal as we all made him out to be, or do you think that the jury may have looked past all of the problems with his credibility?
Gadi, I do not think the jury looked past the problems of his credibility. You know what I think? I think that the prosecution almost put him up as a red herring, as a distraction. Because what happened to the defense? They just focused on Michael Cohen entirely, claiming that if you didn't believe Michael Cohen, the entire case was going to go away. But then if you look at both the jury instructions and then also the prosecution's closing argument, the prosecutors then decided that, or they labeled Cohen as the tour guide of the evidence. They didn't call him their star witness, just the tour guide. And they spent hours, 5 hours, going over the mountain of other evidence that they believed was going to win this case. And that's after the defense gave their closing argument, at which point the defense couldn't even respond. So I almost wonder if the prosecution did this intentionally, knowing that it would turn the defense into this tailspin and just lead them off the trail, which was the alternate evidence, Gadi.
You are very, very gracious with this, Angela, because if you would have said this a week ago, that Cohen was a red herring, I would have been like, I don't know, and yet we see the results here. Sarah, you're sitting here. I got to get your reaction. What do you think? Red herring? Is this a masterful, like, kind of masterminding of what we saw, or is this just a kind of a mishmash of coincidence and just lawyering in the courtroom?
I love how Angela thinks outside the box. Always appreciate that about her. But I don't think he was a red herring. I actually think that in life, Michael Cohen was the fixer, and in this trial, he was the connector. They needed Michael Cohen to make the connection between the hush money payments and Donald Trump and his knowledge of the purpose of the hush money payment. But at the same time, Michael Cohen, the problem that we thought came with Michael Cohen, that he's a prolific liar, ended up not being the problem. The problem was that Michael Cohen was corroborated. Michael Cohen was corroborated by tape. Michael Cohen was corroborated by documents. Michael Cohen was corroborated by other witnesses. So at the end of the day, okay, fine. He is a prolific liar, and he's lied, and we've got him on all kinds of, records lying. But is he lying to you, the jury, today? And he's not. And by the way, Gadi, if it was enough for a lying witness to lead to a not guilty, then I'd be winning all my cases. I've got a lot of Michael Cohens in my cases, and trust me, that's not enough.
Now, Missy, talking about Michael Cohen, I mean, this is a man who basically admitted to stealing from Trump. And kind of helped the case that maybe Trump may not have been watching his books close enough. And yet we saw the result that we just saw today with the conviction. How do you think Michael Cohen played into all this?
Yeah, Gadi, you make a really good point. I always thought that was a very big moment for the defense to extrapolate that and hammer that home to the jury. There was $60,000 that was stolen, money that directly relates to this transaction, and it was stolen right under the nose of Donald Trump. So how close was he to the documents and the actual machinations of how this money was paid to lead to this conclusion? But I think what Sarah said is so on point, and I'm not surprised because I know she deals with these types of witnesses in the white-collar crime world. You have a lot of imperfect witnesses, especially in a case where you're talking about accomplices. You're talking about hatching a scheme. Michael Cohen is a part of that scheme. So, of course, there's always going to be credibility issues. But the point is the jury doesn't have to believe every single thing he said lock, stock, and barrel. They don't even have to like him as a person. They just have to believe that the central elements of his testimony that relate to the crimes and relate to the charges were believable and put some evidentiary weight on them. So I think that's how it all played out after all was said and done in the courtroom.
Yeah, Misty, I thought it was fascinating that they didn't hammer that home a little bit more, too. And, I hate to, again, be a backseat lawyer here, but Angela, when it comes to problems, and when it comes to what the defense did not capitalize on, where does your list start?
So I think it starts with actually their focus almost exclusively on Michael Cohen. I was on your show a couple nights ago, and I said that I felt this case would live and die with Michael Cohen, but not just on his credibility, on if the defense, if the jury believed the defense, that if you believed Michael Cohen or if you didn't believe him, that was going to be the entirety of the case. That was your reason to either acquit or convict, or the opposite, which is that if you believed that there was other corroborating factors that were necessary to get an acquittal or to get a conviction, then you would have to go for the prosecution. So I think the defense then just really focused only on Michael Cohen. A second thing I think they could have probably done a little bit better is this whole concept of just categorical denial. They came out of the gate denying everything. And I think sometimes when you do that on one side, you tend to push the bounds of your own credibility, and you make the jury start to question a lot more of what you say. So in some ways, by saying things like Trump did not sleep with Stormy Daniels, this is extortion, by going that far, it almost put their own credibility in jeopardy, like Michael Cohen put his own when he started allegedly lying on the stand.
And Sarah, I see you nodding your head here. What else is on this list?
I mean, I think, look, it's hard to say what the defense should have done that they didn't do or did wrong, because ultimately none of us know what swayed this jury unless we're behind those closed doors or one of them talks. And so I think they're so focused on Michael Cohen, and then they put on this other prolific liar on the stand, Mr. Costello, who is a complete joke and an embarrassment. They did not put on an expert that they intended to put on, which was the election law expert, which could have potentially helped the jury more with that. But again, I'm critiquing the defense not knowing what really mattered to this jury. So it's hard to tell. But, obviously there's an appeal coming, and I think Trump's team's going to look very carefully at the trial record, at all of the rulings, at all of the objections, and potentially even ineffective assistance of counsel, all the grounds that could possibly be appealed. And then, we'll see what happens there. I think one of the things, Gadi, that's weird about this case is that typically the underlying, or what makes this a felony, is a state election. And here we're dealing with a federal election. Right. So that is sort of a novel issue that is going to be sort of really looked into on appeal, I think.
And Misty, when we're talking about appeal, is there an obvious low-hanging fruit appeal that you see right now? Or do you think that it's going to take some time before we see that?
Well, basically, it's errors of law. So it's evidence that came in that shouldn't have come in, or evidence that should have come in that didn't. So that's what the inquiry is. And you're going to look at every single one of the times that the defense objected and make those arguments on appeal. I do think there's one issue that's really going to be central, and it's the non-prosecution agreement of AMI and Michael Cohen's, that Michael Cohen pled guilty. And one of the things he pled guilty to was that FICA violation, which was one of the unlawful acts. That's an illegal campaign contribution. That came in for credibility only, but the defense had objected to it. So a plea deal usually will not come into the courtroom because it could prejudice the defendant to say, well, if he pled guilty to it and he's part of this conspiracy, how could the defendant not be guilty? So that will be something that will be scrutinized on appeal.
And we'll be watching for all of that. Angela Sinandela, Misty Maris, and Sarah Azari, thank you so much for being with us this hour. And turning now to Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA who brought this case against Donald Trump. He spoke shortly after today's guilty verdict with his prosecutors behind him, and was quick to name-check prosecutor Joshua Steinglass, whose closing arguments lasted more than 5 hours. Take a listen.
Mr. Steinglass, I think some of you probably saw him speak for a little bit the other day. So he's done his job, as has this team. And he just told me, tell him how I feel. I think you said that. I will just say enormous gratitude. Our system, I talked about the jurors at the beginning of my remarks. We have a phenomenal system. 12 everyday New Yorkers. They listen to the judge's directions. They follow the evidence. You saw them in court every day. They were careful and attentive. And so I feel deep gratitude to work alongside them, to be a part of this system. And I just want to echo that this is what we're doing every single day.
All right, and there are so many questions that people continue to ask tonight, and one of them is, can a convicted felon run for president? The short answer is yes. A convicted or imprisoned felon can not only campaign for president, but can be elected. And remember, the qualifications to become president are pretty straightforward. You just have to be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and have lived here for 14 years. And turns out history does have one example of a convicted felon and presidential candidate. The Socialists Party in 1920. The nominee then was Eugene Debs. He campaigned from his jail cell. He was convicted under the Sedition Act for criticizing World War I. Now, he lost that election, but he ended up getting almost 1 million votes, or 3% of the electorate at the time. For more on questions like this, we've got presidential historian Alexis Coe. Alexis, thanks so much for being with us here. So he can run for president, but if he lives in Florida, Florida has notoriously strict laws when it comes to felons voting. And I understand that there's this weird quirk about New York's law that he's not a felon until he's sentenced. But we're talking Florida law, New York law. If he lives in Florida, can he vote there?
It seems as though he cannot vote as a convicted felon. It's also unclear if he can even travel to the RNC, if he can cross state lines. There are a lot of questions. This is certainly, I've spent a lot of time since Trump first ran for office, became president, left saying there's no precedent for this, but there's truly no precedent for this.
Yeah. And is there a possibility or anything in the Constitution barring a president from serving as the president of the United States while also in a prison cell?
No, there is not, because we have to remember that at the Constitutional Convention, there was a lot going on, and the framers looked to the president presiding over the convention, who was George Washington. He reluctantly came from Mount Vernon and thought he was just going to oversee the process. But everyone in the audience, all the framers, James Madison, these people he would actually be estranged from by the end of his presidency, they looked at him and they said, we're not going to figure this all out right now. So that's what we can sort of leave up to Washington. And whatever he does, even if we disagree with him on a lot of political issues, we know that fundamentally he will be guided by a sort of belief in stability and a foundation that the democracy needs to be solid in order to move forward, and that everyone who comes after him will follow this precedent. And so we have what we see here is a lot of gray area. We don't have anything. We don't have a president who leads an insurrection. What do we do in those situations?
A lot of very fascinating questions. And again, you said the word unprecedented, and it's a word that we've said more than any other word in all of this. The date of the sentencing, July 11th, not only is it 4 days before the RNC, it's got its own place in history, right?
It does. It's a rather infamous day in history. It is the day that Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton dueled, and of course, Hamilton died. There are all these connections to founding history, and I hope what we take away from it is not just anecdotal evidence or fillers or fun leads and articles, but rather an understanding that there are laws in place for a reason, and that we can't just say the founders and the framers all the time without really looking at intent and what they stood for. Those are two men who did work hard and had a history of service.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to put this perspective out there, but yeah, we talk about our founders and framers with this degree of reverence, and then we see the coinciding of these dates. And then you got to remember, Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton, that turned into a death match, a literal death match with guns, and one person was killed. Like, politics has been even uglier than this before, right? Can we say that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Partisanship. George Washington went into office and thought, oh, I won't declare a political party and then everything will be fine. And that's what he definitely got wrong. He, by insisting in this sort of bipartisanship that doesn't really exist across, every single topic, unleashed it into the street, this sort of fighting between the two parties. It has always been violent, and particularly in Congress. That was not the first time that Congress had seen guns and bloodshed.
No, hopefully we will never see that again. This is the weirdest way to end the show, the weirdest silver lining I could ever think of. But again, July 11th, the day that President or former President Donald Trump will be sentenced, and also the anniversary of Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton's duel. What a wild day we live in. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for that historic perspective. That's going to do it for us this hour. Our coverage of the Donald Trump verdict continues next with Tom Yamas.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.